The courtroom air was thick with anticipation, a heavy silence pressing down on the spectators gathered within. The polished mahogany walls, having witnessed countless trials unfold, seemed to hum with an energy all their own. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. This wasn't just another day in court. Something felt different, charged, as if the very building held its breath. At the defense table sat Richard Langston, a man who commanded attention without even trying. His custom-tailored Armani suit, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, draped effortlessly over his broad shoulders. He was in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair meticulously slicked back, and an air of self-assurance that bordered on arrogance. He exuded the confidence of someone who had spent years bending the legal system to his will, a man who believed rules were for other people. Langston leaned back in his chair, idly adjusting his cufflinks as the bailiff cleared his throat, preparing for the judge's arrival. He cast a lazy glance around the room, a smirk playing on his lips as he noticed the empty seat behind the bench. "The Honorable Judge Matisse," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Running late, as always." A few stifled chuckles rippled through the defense side of the room. Associates, clerks, even a couple of spectators who recognized Langston's reputation. They knew he was a force to be reckoned with, a man who rarely lost. Across from Langston, seated at the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Sandra Phillips shot him a sharp, disapproving look. She was a woman of quiet intensity, with a sharp mind and an unwavering dedication to justice. She had long learned that men like Langston thrived on reaction, feeding off the discomfort and intimidation they sowed. But today, she had a feeling that his usual tactics wouldn't work. Something about the atmosphere felt different, as if the scales were about to tip. Just then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, breaking the tense silence. The bailiff immediately straightened, his voice booming through the chamber. "All rise. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Michael Harrington presiding." The room collectively rose to its feet as a man in a black robe entered. Judge Harrington moved with a measured, dignified stride, his presence commanding yet understated. He placed a few files on the desk before finally settling into his high-backed chair. Only then did he glance up, his deep brown eyes sweeping across the room, taking in every detail. Langston's smirk faltered as he got his first proper look at the judge. A black man. He scoffed softly under his breath, shaking his head almost imperceptibly as he took his seat. The sound wasn't loud, but in the reverent silence of the courtroom, it was deafening. Judge Harrington's gaze settled on him, his expression unreadable. There was no immediate reaction, no flare of anger, no furrow of offense. Instead, there was a long, quiet stare, one that spoke of patience, of experience, of having seen this brand of arrogance before and knowing exactly how to handle it. Langston, oblivious to the subtle shift in energy, leaned forward, tapping his pen against the desk. "Let's move this along, shall we, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some of us have real cases to get to." The room held its breath. Judge Harrington tilted his head slightly, his voice steady and controlled. "I see," he said. "And you are?" He paused, a subtle emphasis in his tone. "I ask because, Mr. Langston, in my court, respect is not optional. And so far, you've shown none." A few hushed murmurs scattered across the gallery. Phillips sat a little straighter, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Langston, for the first time in years, hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own carefully crafted domain. Judge Harrington flipped open a file before him, his gaze never leaving Langston's. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "I believe a lesson in humility is in order, Mr. Langston. One you are long overdue to learn." Langston's smirk completely dissolved, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. This wasn't going according to plan. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a shade higher than before, "I assure you no disrespect was intended. I simply meant—" Judge Harrington cut him off with a raised hand. "Save it, Mr. Langston. Your actions speak louder than your words." He shuffled through the files, pulling out a single sheet of paper. "I'm looking at a motion filed last week, a motion to dismiss this case based on what you call lack of probable cause." Interesting. Especially considering. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes locking onto Langston's. Considering the source of that supposed lack of probable cause. Langston shifted in his seat, the carefully constructed facade of confidence beginning to crack. Your Honor, I object. What's on those papers is privileged information only a counsel can access. Langston said, trying to win the argument by using his lawyer instincts. Overruled. This court has a vested interest in ensuring justice is served, and that includes understanding the foundation upon which your arguments are built. Or, in this case, unbuilt, Judge Harrington said, his voice laced with steel. He continued reading from the paper. The supposed lack of probable cause stems from a confidential informant within the police department. An informant who claims the evidence against your client was fabricated. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. A fabricated evidence claim was serious, one that could unravel the entire case and potentially expose corruption within the police force. Phillips felt a cold dread wash over her. She hadn't been informed of any such informant. Judge Harrington set the paper down, leaning forward. Mr. Langston, are you prepared to reveal the identity of this informant? Langston hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Revealing the informant could expose them, putting them in danger and potentially jeopardizing his entire defense strategy. But refusing could be seen as obstruction of justice, angering the judge and swaying the jury against him. Your Honor, with all due respect, that information is highly sensitive. I can't reveal them. They will be in danger. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before filing a motion based on their testimony. In fact, you have put them in danger by filing the motion, said the judge in response. Judge Harrington steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. Very well, Mr. Langston. In that case, I am impounding this motion and launching an immediate investigation into the alleged fabricated evidence. Furthermore, I'm assigning a special prosecutor to investigate the source of this information. And Mr. Langston, he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, if it turns out this informant is fabricating their information, or if you are found to have knowingly presented false evidence to this court, you will face the consequences. He paused, letting his words sink in. Langston was visibly shaken, his face pale. This was a game changer. He had expected a routine hearing, a quick victory. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a high-stakes gamble, with everything on the line. Judge Harrington turned his attention to Phillips. Ms. Phillips, I expect your full cooperation with this investigation. I want to know everything about this case, every piece of evidence, every witness. Leave no stone unturned. Phillips nodded, a mix of apprehension and determination swirling within her. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She was not sure she could trust everyone in the DA office anymore. Langston looked at her with an unsettling fear in his eyes. What was he scared of more? The judge or the possible truth? She turned back to the judge. Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice firm. I will. The battle had just begun. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity as Judge Harrington's words hung in the air. Langston's team scrambled to regroup, their confident demeanor replaced by frantic whispers and worried glances. Phillips, on the other hand, felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was it, the break she had been waiting for. She gathered her thoughts, mentally preparing herself for the long and arduous road ahead. As the courtroom began to clear, Judge Harrington summoned Phillips to his chambers. Ms. Phillips, I want to discuss the investigation with you in more detail, he said, his voice low and serious. I have a feeling that there's more to this case than meets the eye, and I need someone I can trust to get to the bottom of it. Phillips nodded, following the judge out of the courtroom and into the corridor. They walked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of the judge's robes and the muted hum of the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Once inside the judge's chambers, Phillips took a seat in one of the plush leather chairs, her eyes scanning the room. The judge's chambers were a far cry from the sterile, utilitarian decor of the courtroom. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with books and mementos from the judge's long and distinguished career. A large wooden desk dominated the center of the room, behind which the judge sat, his eyes fixed intently on Phillips. Ms. Phillips, I want you to understand the gravity of this situation, he said, his voice low and serious. If it's true that evidence was fabricated, it's not just a matter of a simple miscarriage of justice. It's a corruption that goes all the way to the top, and it's our duty to expose it. Phillips nodded, her mind racing with the implications. She had always known that the justice system was flawed, but she had never imagined that it was this corrupt. I want you to work with the special prosecutor I'm assigning to this case, the judge continued. Together, you'll follow every lead, interview every witness, and leave no stone unturned. I want the truth, Ms. Phillips, no matter how ugly it may be. Phillips nodded, a sense of determination washing over her. She was ready for this challenge, ready to take on the corrupt system and bring justice to the people. As she left the judge's chambers, Phillips felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She was no longer just a prosecutor, she was a crusader, a champion of justice in a system that seemed determined to pervert it. The special prosecutor, a gruff, no-nonsense woman named Rachel, was waiting for her in the corridor. "So you're the one who's going to help me take down the corrupt elite," she said, a wry smile spreading across her face. Phillips smiled back, a sense of camaraderie forming between them. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm. Together, they set out to uncover the truth, to follow the trail of evidence and see where it led. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that they would face obstacles and challenges at every turn. But they were determined, driven by a sense of justice and a desire to expose the corrupt system for what it was. As they delved deeper into the case, they began to uncover a web of deceit and corruption that went all the way to the top. They discovered that the police department had been infiltrated by a corrupt officer, one who had been fabricating evidence and framing innocent people for years. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. As they dug deeper, they found that the corruption went far beyond the police department. It reached into the highest echelons of power, into the very heart of the justice system itself. Phillips and Rachel knew that they had to be careful, that they were taking on a powerful and ruthless enemy. But they were undaunted, driven by their determination to bring justice to the people and to expose the corrupt system for what it was. As they worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build their case, they knew that they were in for the fight of their lives. But they were ready, armed with the truth and a fierce determination to see justice served. Weeks turned into months. Phillips and Rachel, fueled by copious amounts of coffee and unwavering determination, meticulously pieced together the puzzle. They followed the money, interviewed countless witnesses, and risked their careers, and potentially their lives, to expose the rot within the system. The confidential informant Langston had cited turned out to be a low-level beat cop named Miller. Initially hesitant, Miller eventually cracked under Rachel's relentless questioning, admitting that he had been pressured by his superior, Captain Davies, to falsify evidence in numerous cases, including the one against Marcus. He was terrified of Davies and the repercussions of speaking out, but the weight of his guilt had become unbearable. The trail led them higher and higher, uncovering a network of corrupt officials accepting bribes, manipulating evidence, and protecting powerful figures from prosecution. Captain Davies, a respected figure in the police force, was at the center of it all, pulling the strings and lining his pockets. As Phillips and Rachel gathered irrefutable evidence, they knew they were running out of time. Davies and his cronies were becoming increasingly suspicious, and they could feel the pressure mounting. Whispers turned into threats, veiled at first, then becoming more direct. Finally, they had enough. Armed with affidavits, financial records, and Miller's testimony, they presented their findings to Judge Harrington. The judge, his face grim but resolute, authorized a series of arrests, including Captain Davies and several high-ranking officials in the DA's office who had been complicit in the scheme. The arrests sent shockwaves through the city. Langston, caught in the crossfire, scrambled to distance himself from the scandal. He claimed he was merely acting on information provided by his client and had no knowledge of the fabricated evidence. While he faced scrutiny, he managed to avoid criminal charges, though his reputation was tarnished. The trial of Captain Davies and his co-conspirators was a media circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens eager to see justice served. Phillips and Rachel presented their evidence meticulously, painting a damning picture of corruption and abuse of power. Davies, arrogant and defiant, maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed by disgruntled officers and a politically motivated prosecution. But the evidence was overwhelming. Miller, despite his fear, testified against Davies, his voice trembling but his words clear. The jury deliberated for days, the tension in the city reaching fever pitch. Finally, the verdict came, guilty on all counts. Cheers erupted in the courtroom and spilled out into the streets. Justice, after so long, had been served. Marcus was exonerated and released from prison. He walked out a free man, his name cleared, thanks to the relentless efforts of Phillips and Rachel. He looked at Phillips, a glimmer of hope in his weary eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me my life back." Phillips smiled, a sense of satisfaction washing over her. It had been a long and arduous journey, but it had been worth it. They had exposed the rot within the system and brought justice to an innocent man. But the fight wasn't over. The scandal had exposed deep-seated corruption that would take years to eradicate. Phillips and Rachel knew they had a long road ahead, but they were determined to continue fighting for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the system worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. As Phillips walked away from the courthouse, she knew she could never look at her job the same again. She wasn't just a prosecutor, she was a guardian of justice. And she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The city felt cleaner, somehow, the air a little fresher. There was hope, a fragile bud pushing through the concrete, that things could change, that justice could prevail, even in the darkest corners.